Fans of the Brülosophy podcast know that every 10th episode is a question answering show called Brü A. I always love to hear the inventive and sometimes quite wacky things these homebrewers are up to. And today, myself and Will from the Brü Club are holding our own Brü A with questions submitted from our Brülosophy patrons. And I'll also be showing off a handy method for serving from kegs when on the go. Let's get to it. This episode is sponsored by Kegland. More on them in a bit. Okay, Will, welcome to Brü A, our first ever Brü A.
Thanks for having me back.
So I brought the A, thanks to our Patreons, and you've brought the B, the brew.
I did.
So tell me, what have we got here?
So we got my attempt at an ESB.
You're playing to the home crowd here. That's one of my favorite beer styles.
So it's basically just, base malt. Kind of did two different malts. I just generic 2-row and some cookie malt to kind of mimic that Maris Otter kind of flavor, and then just some crystal. My attempt at a basic English beer.
Yeah, this is very much my style. All right, well, while we're enjoying this, we've got to answer some questions from our patrons. So the first one comes from Tom Sills, and Tom asks about yeast hydration. So Tom says, what are the pros and cons of adding mash wort to the yeast before pitching versus adding boiled wort after having it cooled down to the yeast for hydration? Seems to me the use of mash wort is safe due to its reaching pasteurization temperatures, and this has the advantage of more time to activate the yeast prior to pitch. What are your thoughts? So, Will, is this something you've done?
I have done something like this. So I typically wouldn't use yeast from wort from the mash. I would probably want to go with something that's been boiled. Although I did take a look, pasteurization temperatures, common one is 170. So if you're doing a mash out step, it should be pasteurized. So I think you would be fine if you want to do that. Personally, if you're using dry yeast, I say there's really no bother to do that. What my method is with dry yeast, I use dry yeast quite often, and I go straight from the package into the fermenter when I'm racking into chilled wort. My experience, usually dry yeast is starting to ferment. You'll start to see the bubbles, about 12 to 20 hours after pitch, and it's rocking and rolling by 24 hours. So that's kind of my experience with dry yeast. I don't know. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, some of these packets say don't rehydrate, don't they, on the packet?
Yeah, they do now.
Just to repitch. I mean, I've done these vitality starters before, and like you, I've taken wort from the boil to do that. But then, the vitality starter life isn't as long because what I'll typically do is I will just steal some yeast after sort of 5 minutes of boiling, chill it down, and then add my yeast into that. So then during the rest of the boil plus the cooling time, the yeast is at least getting introduced to the wort. But it's not very long. It's not a very long starter. And then I'd like to add the yeast in as soon as the wort is at pitching temperature, because I don't want it sat there potentially getting infected with something else, right?
Yeah.
But I haven't tried this mash idea. But it does make sense. As you say, pasteurization can happen much lower than boiling temperatures. And I think 160, 170, that kind of range, you only need about 10 minutes or so to be considered pasteurized. So should work.
Should work. The thing that I did read about that pasteurization temperature is that they're generally flash cooling whatever they're pasteurizing right after that step. So I would be a little concerned that you have something that wasn't boiled, sitting around at room temperature and spinning up that yeast for whatever an hour or two. I don't think it's going to be a problem, but as you pointed out, typically most of these dry yeast providers are encouraging you not to rehydrate nowadays, just to direct pitch. They do provide instructions for rehydration, but I think you're better off just. The risk of contamination is just a lot less if you just direct pitch into that chilled wort.
Well, thanks, Tom, for the question. Now, second one comes from Jeremy Stoner, possibly real name.
I'm sure.
I have a question about managing the boil on an electric all-in-one system inside my house. Do condenser attachments work well, and what are the pros and cons of them? Have you tried a steam condenser, Will?
I have not, but there are several members of the Brü Club that do, and I reached out to them when I got this question. And what I found is overall, the pros far outweighed the cons. They reported, having a reduced energy from they can lower the temperature of their electric controller or their burner. So they're going at like 50% of like max power. They use a lot less water as far as there's not as much boil off, so they don't need as much water in like the mash. It does greatly reduce the smell, which everybody who's brewed knows it does smell. Although many of us enjoy that smell. Not everybody does. The wife and kids and whoever else is around generally don't like it. But so it does cut quite down on the smell. The big con was the water usage. So you do have to have spray steam, or not steam, just water has to be sprayed down to create a vacuum. So that does use quite a bit. What I was told is about 10 gallons an hour, depending on what kind of condenser you have.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I brew in my basement, and I got pretty interested in these steam condensers myself. So I took a steam condenser from Spike, and I tried to use it with my claw hammer kettle. The two things are not designed for each other, so they didn't quite fit. It was like 2 or 3 millimeters it was just too big, so I couldn't quite seal it off, and you do need to seal it off completely. So with a bit of jerry rigging, I was able to do that. But some of the downsides you mentioned, I definitely experienced those as well, in that just the volume of water that you have the intake bucket, and then you have the drain bucket.
Right.
And it's surprising. I mean, the way this works is it's just spraying this cold water onto the steam to condense it back out. You go through a lot of water during your boil. Now, I did try this idea of just, how about I just use one bucket of kind of ice water and keep that cold? So I gave that a go, and the problem I had was I couldn't keep it cool very long.
No. Yeah.
So it started off as basically ice water, and within about 10-15 minutes it was up to around 70 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius level, and I was like frantically adding more ice. Then I'd run out of ice, and I couldn't keep it going. And also, as you say, the smell from that, I mean, I spoke to some of the folks at Spike, and they told me you really don't want to reuse that water because you got sort of DMS particulates and whatnot in there that you're now spraying back in, which might not be the best idea. And then the other problem I had with the steam condenser lid was it messes with all of your boil off rates. So yeah, it's great that it reduces boil off, but now you need to know what is my new boil off rate. So I had to calculate all of that. And then I was a little unsure if it would have an effect on hop utilization as well, because I'm kind of under pressure when I'm doing this. Adding in the hops, especially if there were a lot of hop additions, it's kind of awkward. You have to unscrew something, add the hops in, screw it back up again. So for me, the downsides far outweighed the benefit of, yes, no smell and no steam to deal with the fans. So I haven't ended up using it myself very much. But I can certainly see in situations where you don't want steam that it could be a good option. And perhaps if I'd used a system that was designed for the whole thing, so if I'd used a Spike kettle along with a Spike steam condenser lid, maybe it would have worked a bit better. Now, we'll get back to the Brü and A questions in a moment, but first a quick word about today's sponsor, which is Kegland. Now, rather than just tell you about Kegland, I thought it'd be fun to kind of show you some of the things that I use from Kegland, some of my favorite stuff. And today, this is what I want to show you. This thing here is fantastic for serving beer. It's the NukaTap Mini Beer Faucet Assembly Kit. I think that's what it's called. And here's the point of it. So let's say you've got a keg of beer and you want to take it with you somewhere to serve it. I often take my kegs and I'll take them to our neighborhood get-togethers. Now, to do that, I need to bring some CO2 to keep the keg charged for dispensing, and then I have to bring like a tap handle, a picnic tap handle or something like that. This kind of eliminates all of that. So what we've got here is we've got this flow control valve here. Now this connects as a ball lock quick disconnect onto your gas post, and this handle on the top here, or this dial on the top, this lets you set how much pressure to let in and out of the keg. So you can kind of dial this down or dial it up depending on how much pressure is in the keg. And then connected to that, we have this NukaTap Mini beer tap, which is super, super small, which is really good because it's so small, it has a very low thermal mass, which means you're going to get less foam when you're pouring the beer. Now, what I will do is I will set my keg to something quite high in terms of pressure at home, so maybe 20 psi, which is far too high for regular serving pressure, but then I'll kind of dial it down, the pressure here, using this to get whatever pressure I need, and then I can just dispense the beer out of this. And as the pressure starts to lower in the keg, I can just open this a bit more. So I don't have to bring my CO2, and I don't have to bring a picnic tap with a big long cable. Big fan of this. So Kegland, yeah, really the ultimate destination for all your brewing and dispensing requirements. And I also want to point out they have a really, really good YouTube channel that demos a lot of this stuff that's hosted by Key, and you can learn all about their latest products there. So check out all Kegland have to offer at kegland.com.au. Back to the questions. Okay, next question is from Walter F. So Walter says, have you had any scorching or carbonizing issues when doing long or high SG brews on an electric system? And I figured that was a question not asked just purely in theory, because he goes on to say that I have scorched the wort when trying to make a wheat wine with an OG of around 1.1. Pretty high. My wort started at 1060 and I smelled the scorching after 2 hours of boiling with a ripple heating element. I figured that the wort was around 1090 at that point. The ripple element was set to about 3000 watts and then increased to 3500 watts during the boil. I can vary the wattage of the heating element, so to avoid the scorching of the wort, would you recommend to 1, stay boiling on a lower wattage, like maybe 2000 watts for a longer time, or 2, not boil high gravity brews with this setup, or 3, boil at 3500 watts until the SG reaches, say, 1080, then drop the power to 2000 watts for the duration? Well, before we get to what we think the best of those options are, Will, have you had a situation of scorching your wort?
I have not. I have almost had this happen where I did see the evidence on the bottom of my electric system, and had I boiled longer, say like 2 hours, I definitely would have ended up with some scorching, but unfortunately I did not. So
yeah, I have scorched some beer, and not for the reasons that it was just too high in gravity, just simply because I've been trying to brew very small batches in systems that are not intended to do that, and I think my water level just dropped below my heating element, like just marginally, and you can hear it, this kind of noise instantly, and say, uh-oh, something's gone wrong here. And 2 problems with that. 1, getting the scorched wort off of the heating element took me like an hour to clean that stuff off. Really difficult to get it off. Secondly, the beer tasted like burnt death. It was awful. And just with a tiny bit of scorching, I mean, it was scorching for not more than a few seconds. So so to be avoided. I think we could agree that scorching is something to be avoided, not a characteristic you're going to enjoy in a beer, especially a barley wine or something like that. So of these options, what would you recommend?
The one thing that I kind of kept seeing about scorching was it's like high protein grains that are being used. Wheat, rye, oats, things that have a lot of protein in them, maybe a lot of beta glucans. Now, depending on how you're doing your mash, if you're, a single vessel person, you might have a lot of, and depending on how fine you're grinding that, you might have a lot of fine particulars in your wort. And that, in my instance, that was what happened with me. I was making an oatmeal stout. There was a lot of oatmeal in that, not a ton, but there was enough oatmeal in that was what was collected on the bottom, was all that ground up oat stuff from the mash. So what I would say is I would definitely probably do a lower wattage, maybe like 2000 for a longer period, if you want to go through the boil off rate. But I think what I would focus on if you're going to do something like that again is try to really get clear wort into that kettle as much as you can. Maybe grind a little bit coarser. I know that will mess with the starting gravity, but that might be, or maybe even grind that high protein, the wheat or the rye or whatever, grind it separately at a little bit wider setting so you're not getting so many fine particulates in there. But I think that's how I would probably try to attack that. And then like you said, probably the lower wattage for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I was interested to see that comment about the wattage from requiring 3,500 watts because I find with my system, I'm boiling at maybe 40% of the power capacity, even with a 10-gallon batch. It just doesn't need more than that to reach a pretty comfortable rolling boil. So you could certainly lower it, and even if you don't get a rolling boil, we've had plenty of experiments where we've just kind of gone a little bit under the actual boil temperature, and it's still been fine. You're going to have a much lower boil off rate, so that is something to account for. Like with the steam condenser, but that would be a valid option as well, just to dial it back a bit. But I'd love to try this beer.
I would. I'd like to try it. The unscorched version.
Yes. Speaking of beer, I mean, this is a really good beer. I mean, are you happy with how this has turned out?
I am happy.
Yeah. Okay. Now the last question we've got today is from Rich, and we enjoy questions that are not just like brewing knowledge questions, but just sort of fun questions as well. So Rich asks, what in the brewing world is exciting for 2025? Maybe a competition or an ingredient or a style or some equipment. What are you looking forward to in 2025?
I personally think you're going to still see a lot of the non-alcoholic options start to, more breweries are going to be making them, or low alcohol. Not probably so much the low alcohol, but like going to still get a lot of non-alcohol options. I think those are going to be more. I think one thing that I think we're going to start seeing, I think we're going to, as far as like the stores go, I think you're still going to see like IPA everywhere you look, at least in the States. But I think you are going to see some breweries start to focus on non-IPA options, like maybe some old core beers, maybe bringing some old styles back, maybe like an American wheat or maybe a brown ale, something like that. I think that might be a thing. I think people are kind of, maybe not the hardcores, but I think some of the casuals are kind of getting IPA fatigue, that everything's an IPA and they're kind of done with IPAs, at least, the casual craft beer drinker. But I think if they start bringing back some of those core beers and start focusing on some of those non-hoppy options, I think you might see that this year.
Yeah, I'm all for more traditional styles like this appearing at more bars. Now, I mean, I did a video on 2025 predictions with Jordan Folks at Brülosophy, and the trend that Jordan mentioned on the video were West Coast Pilsners as the style he thought was going to make a splash, which is mainly because he really likes West Coast Pilsners. I haven't really at that point, I hadn't really had many of them myself, so I started to look for them at breweries and whatnot, and I'm a bit of a fan now as well, because you get that clean, crisp lagery taste, but you also get really a real taste of the hops as well.
Yes.
So it's kind of a best of both worlds sort of situation where you're getting some of these often fruit forward hops, but you're also getting that clean, crisp lager. If this isn't a big style for this year, I would be surprised because it's delicious.
I totally agree. I might change my answer.
Well, Will, thank you very much for answering all of the questions this time. And thanks also to all of the patrons for submitting them. We're going to make a habit of this, doing it every 10 episodes or so. So if you have questions, please give us a shout. There's an email address in the description below. And I have to say, Will, thank you very much for providing this ESB. It's delicious.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.